Story 1. Alligator Gar Terror. I remember back when I was much younger, in the early 2000s, when I used to go on little fishing trips with my few group of cousins. Well, they weren't really my cousins, more just a close group of friends that I grew up with. So much so that they were practically my cousins, or my brothers, whichever term you prefer. I had grown up with these same dinguses since I was just a little boy, and in doing so, became very close. We played together all the time as little kids, so we knew each other well. Except Devin. I mention his name because he's the one who got severely beat up after this incident. I could have gotten severely injured, which is why he got beat up by my other brothers or cousins. I'll use the term cousins for the sake of confusion. And yes, Devin is his real name. Since I'm not releasing his last name, I don't see any harm in revealing his real first name. Now, while I love Devin like a brother, he's just an idiot, makes a string of bad decisions, and just does a lot of stupid stuff for the sake of being stupid, even if it causes others to come in harm's way, or like in my scenario, actually potentially drown or get hurt. Which leads me to the actual event in question. Me, Devin, and my other cousins went on a little fishing trip. We have this decent-sized lake near where we all live, and surprisingly, is not really popular. While there are fishermen that go out onto the lake, it's not as hopping as some of the more popular lakes. I think that has to do with it being a little more tucked into the woods, which benefits us. We get more privacy, and more time to go out by ourselves without being bugged, better catches, and all around better times. This day was really no different than any other day. It was June, the weather was hot and humid, and it was us with a small little boat. We threw it out on the lake. I got in, Devin got in, and the others were shore fishing. For the record, I know how to swim, and I know that there are animals in this lake that I should avoid, particularly alligator gar. Even though gars are not really aggressive, nor do they attack people, there are fish that, due to their teeth, I don't really want to come up close and personal with one, if you catch my drift. No pun intended with what happens. So, I'll fast forward past all the boring minute details. We get out, close to the center of the lake, and I've already cast my line in the water. Devin, not really being much of a fisherman, and more of a follower, is just sitting in the boat, bored, making loud, obnoxious noises, after I've continued to ask him to stop. Then, he begins to get even more obnoxious, and looking back, I'm not sure if he thought he was funny, or what he was doing, but he wasn't that stupid to not know what he could have done. He stands up, and starts swaying the boat, singing that dumb song, "Rock the boat, don't rock the boat. Rock the boat, don't rock the boat." This causes me to lose my balance, and I drop my rod into the water because he is tilting the boat so hard with his body weight that now I am losing balance. As I go to stand up to try and catch my entire rod from going under, I lose balance and I fall headfirst into the lake. I probably plunged no more than maybe 8 or 10 feet into the water, since I'm only 5'9", and maybe 170 pounds soaking wet. I'm not a big guy, but as I submerged into the water, I came face to face with what I believe, from what I saw, to easily have been an 8 to 10 foot alligator gar. Easily maybe 250 pounds. I was nearly 6 inches away from its face, and it scared me so bad, I swam up to the surface, screaming, freaking out. Out of all the odds, it probably just so happened to be swimming right at that exact spot at the same time that I happened to fall in, and we just happened to meet, face to face. I feel bad for being honest and giving you the disappointing truth. This fish wasn't bloodthirsty. It did not suddenly grow an urge or taste for human flesh and ravenously attack me. It left me alone, like most fish do. I was able to pull myself back up on the boat and nearly give Devin a black eye for doing that. He just thought the whole thing was funny, and I maintained my composure and willingness to want to deck him right in the face. I waited till we got back to shore, and unfortunately, I lost my really nice fishing reel in the lake. That I did not get back. When we got back onto shore, pretty much right afterwards, I went to go change, and my cousins beat the crap out of Devin. Didn't break his nose or anything, nor did they beat him with any objects, but he certainly got a fat lip and a good black eye, and a couple bruises on his body. After all, he realized afterwards that he deserved it. That, my good friend, is my face-to-face encounter ever with an alligator gar. Story 2. The Thing Out of the River. Back when I was only 12 years old, I spent a lot of time fishing by myself, and although I didn't have the greatest equipment, I made the most of it. I took my little makeshift swimming pole and my tackle box and went out to a small creek not far behind my house. This creek, like many creeks in the area, feed into a larger river that's close by. You can catch a good amount of fish along that river, but sometimes it's not exactly safe with the rapids, even though the fishing is better. So I prefer the creeks, and if you know the right spots, they are great for smallmouth bass. So I found my usual good spot that I like to go to, set my stuff down, threw my reel in, and waited. And waited. I hadn't got a bite yet today, which was kind of unusual. Usually, this spot was great for catching, but I guess it was normal to have some days that were slower than others. I don't even think it had been more than an hour. Definitely some time had passed, but I hear this weird sound. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it sounded like somebody with wet shoes. Maybe they had just jumped into the river and was now walking in my direction. It was like a plop, 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 plop sound, but not like water dripping, just like a squishy kind of footstep. That's when I divided my attention between the water that my line was in and the sound that was slowly approaching me. To my left, where the sound was coming from, was a small series of rocks, and the sound that was approaching was coming closer and closer to these rocks. If whoever it was trying to come over to me or come past me, they would have to climb past these rocks, which means that as soon as they climbed over these rocks, I would have full view of whoever or whatever it was, and they, me. Well, that's exactly what happened, only a few moments later. Climbing over the rock was what I thought initially to be some sort of person, maybe a passerby who decided to take a nice fresh dip, maybe a crazy homeless person, but that's not what it ended up being. What I saw that day looked like something designed by a special effects department out of a Hollywood movie. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the creature from the Black Lagoon, but also more fish or amphibious looking. Very, very ugly. It was like gray, silvery, and black, slimy, kind of disgusting, and had green, yellowish eyes that had slits, just like that of a reptile. Its mouth had sharp little teeth, and it kind of had somewhat, I don't want to say snout, but its mouth did protrude a little bit, and it appeared to have webbings all over its arms, legs, and hands. It also appeared to be soaking wet, as if this thing just crawled out of the river. It looked at me, and I it, and we just kind of had a stare down for probably 10 seconds. Before I kid you not, I stood up, left my reel, left my tackle box, and just ran off, back to my house. 12-year-old me was not prepared to deal with something at all like this. Story 3. The Florida Alligator Man. Okay, time to share my story. While we weren't exactly fishing just yet, we were on our way. I, my father, and my uncle were on an airboat, riding through thick, uncharted swamps in the Everglades to find the perfect fishing spot. My uncle actually did airboat tours for a living, so it made sense that he would have his own airboat, an amazing family perk for my father and I. We used to ride in that thing all the time with him, but I digress. During this day, we were in search for a fishing spot that my uncle had had his eye on while he had given tours. He was taking us to this very spot when we ran over something really large in the water. It gave a huge bump, and we all immediately looked back. Then my uncle said, "I think we just ran over a really large alligator." Well, when we all turned back, we could see something surfacing. Then, we see the head of what looked to be an alligator pop up. And then, this is where the true horror sets in. This alligator stood up, fully on two legs, completely erect like a man standing, and looked back at our boat with an expression like, "Don't you dare come back here, or I'll show you what for." All three of us saw it. There's no denying it. And I've heard stories of the alligator man before, but I never knew that it or they existed. We never spoke about it the rest of the day. Story 1. A Scream in the Woods. This happened quite a bit of time ago, but I could still remember it as if it happened last week. I'll never forget those screams that I had heard. Those are forever embedded in my memory banks. This was back in 1996, July. I was camping in western Idaho. I can't remember the mountain area that I was around, but I was solo camping and had just gotten up in the early morning hours, was getting ready to make my coffee. I was just getting my fire going when off in the distance, I heard the most horrendous scream that I had ever heard. Don't be fooled. This was no mountain lion scream. I've heard plenty of those, and this sounded nothing like that. In fact, out of all the animals I have ever heard make noise in the wild, this sounded nothing like either of them. This was something else entirely. It sounded like a mix of a huge man with giant lungs and a very angry gorilla. That's the best way I can put it together in words. It was unlike anything I've ever heard in my life, and it scared me. The sheer power and force behind it was something to be reckoned with. Due to the distortion and reverberation of sound throughout the valley, you can't really tell how close or how far sound is. At least where I was. These powerful screams, or roars, in their entirety, lasted roughly 15 to 20 seconds, with a very short tail end. I'm not joking you. They lasted an incredibly long amount of time, which astonished me as much as it made me fearful. The one roar, the singular scream, was followed up with loud wood knocking, maybe not even a few moments later, and that were random patterns in groups of 3. Either something was trying to communicate to me, or something was trying to communicate to another one of it. I don't fancy Bigfoot stories, but this one always takes me back to the possibility that there might be something more than I bargained for deep in the woods. Story 2. Waiting for the Opportunity. Back when I was a child, probably around 7 or 8 years of age, there was a very small creek that I used to love playing at with my brothers and sisters. Well, one day, I distinctly remember playing down by this same creek on a hot summer day, and after my brothers and sisters both left me by myself, for what reasons I can't remember, probably to go grab lunch or a snack, I was left to throw and skip rocks all by myself. I wasn't scared or lonely. I loved being at the creek, whether being by myself or by the company of my family. It was always so peaceful and beautiful. But that day, I remember gaining a whole new perspective of that little creek and feeling something my 7-year-old self had never felt before. A terrible fear from deep within your body. Not just the feeling of fear, but a feeling where your entire body is consumed by one horrible emotion. I noticed, even at that young age of 7 or 8, the feeling of being watched or observed by something. When I looked up, I didn't see anything. I can remember I was probably ankle deep in the creek. I think either looking for rocks, maybe crawdads, maybe fish, when I ignored the feeling. At that young age, I don't think I quite understood gut instinct and what it meant to feel being watched or being followed, or that you're potentially in danger. I was so young and naive, probably for the better, but, as feelings do, it persisted and lasted, and only grew and grew in strength. When finally, I remember, I was looking all around me, wondering why I was feeling like somebody was watching me, when out of the corner of my eye, off on a small hill, not too far away, was a face staring me, high from the trees. It kind of resembled that of a deer, but I could see the outline of a skull and antlers. I can definitely remember seeing empty eye sockets, as if it was a skull, hence why I described it as that. The body was all black, and I remember seeing large claws holding onto the branches of the tree that this thing was in front of, or behind, since it was surrounded by them, and appeared to be holding onto both in front and back to be able to see me. The scenery might be kind of hard to explain, so excuse me tripping over my words, but I'm trying to recall this and type it up at the same time. I don't think I was exactly terrified. I think at 7 years old, I was curious and wondering what I was looking at. I didn't realize in this state of mind and age, this was some sort of demonic-looking creature, because as an adult, I could tell you now, if I were to paint this creature, that's exactly what it would resemble. But 7-year-old me had never seen such a thing. I never watched scary movies. I never saw any sort of terrible drawings or any depictions of monsters. That realm of reality was never a part of my childhood. Probably for the better. At least until this very day. I remember standing there, I should say, studying it thoroughly, as it studying me. That's when it began to move closer, as if it got the green light to move in for the kill. I saw more and more of its features. It was stocky, covered in very black fur. It was jet black, blacker than midnight, and it had very long arms. The forearms, I remember, were incredibly long. The hands were incredibly slender, and each finger was like a long claw. I'll never forget, it had one large opposable thumb with a long 8-inch or so claw, and it had 3 fingers, also extremely long, oversized, and mainly just a long claw on it. It had small legs, also covered in this black fur jet black, like the rest of its body. I didn't see a tail, and I didn't really see any feet, but its shoulders were the most bulky, like it was lifting weights, and all the weight and bulk were in its width and shoulders, and its head was this weird-looking deer-like skull with large deformed antlers. I don't remember seeing any eyes, just empty eye sockets that stared back at me, lifelessly. But yet, this skull was clearly attached to a living thing, an animal. I have never seen an animal in my life that has the head of a corpse or a skull. I didn't quite understand it, but what I did understand is as it approached me more comfortably and faster, I began to really understand that this meant me nothing but harm, and only harm, and that I should run if I value my safety, comfort, and life. The closer it got, and the more I saw of it, it scared 7-year-old me pretty bad. And when it got close enough, that was more than enough for me, and I took off running, fleeing up the small hill, back up to where my other brothers and sisters were playing. I didn't dare tell my mom and dad. They would have blew me off. But I did to my other brothers and sisters, don't go and play down by the creek anymore. Of course, being a child, I was met with laughter, joking, and mockery. They ended up going back down there and playing that same day, but never saw anything. I too eventually went back down there with my brothers and sisters. Again, never saw that thing again. Now, as an adult, I look back at the situation and review it with a much more intelligent consciousness. I almost wonder if that thing had been waiting, just the same way lions do when they go after a pack of gazelle. They wait to weed out the weakest and slowest one, single them out so the prey is easier to capture. And I wonder if that's the exact same mentality this thing had. Assuming, with having just a skull for a head, it had those thoughts. But it had the thoughts enough to watch me, to come closer to me, to try and grab me from what I can remember. Clearly, this was some sort of unknown predatory thing. And if I would have stayed there, it for sure would have grabbed me and took me to God only knows where. That was also, that I can remember, the only time I was ever really down by the creek by myself for that long, with having nobody else around. Sure, I had been down there by myself before, but never longer than a few moments, as a brother or sister was always close by, and somebody either had to make a snack run or a bathroom run. But this was the only time I was actually abandoned for more than 10, 20, 30 minutes. Maybe that's why this thing decided to move in. Who knows how long it had been watching us play, for maybe not just that day, but for days, seasons, possibly years. All I know is, I still see this thing in my nightmares sometimes, and it still scares me just as bad as the day that it tried to come grab me. If you or somebody you know has an encounter they would like me to read on this channel, please submit it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. The email can be found in the description below. My boyfriend had lived in Michigan, and I in Northern California. We dated on and off for several years, online, before I finally made the move to go live close to him so we could actually have a fruitful relationship. Over the years we spent together, we grew closer and also realized we had a common interest in hiking, camping, and the outdoors. This brought us closer together than ever before, until we had one terrible camping trip that would change my life and perspective of the outdoors for a very long time. For this camping trip, my boyfriend isn't really a drinker, but he, for whatever reason I'm not sure, decided to load up on a 24-pack of beer. I'm a lightweight, and it takes me about 2 beers in total to be plastered. But personally, I'm not a fan of drinking, so 1 beer is about it for me. And that's all I had that night. Around 7, maybe 7:30. My boyfriend insisted during the night that I try and drink more, let loose, enjoy myself. He, I believe, took it too far. After having roughly 4 or 5 beers, he became beer unconscious. You drinkers know how that is. He too is a lightweight and hardly ever drinks, which goes back to my original question. Why did he need to get a 24-pack? It was just him and I. He must have thought we were in for a wild night. And a wild night I had, but we didn't even know that yet. So it gets to about 9-10 p.m., and he's so drunk, he's ready to pass out. Me, I'm a little bit more on the irritated side, having wanted to have a nice, relaxing evening with my boyfriend, and he ruined it by getting far too drunk and going in the tent to pass out. If you know anything about somebody passing out after they're drunk, they're pretty much impossible to wake. A hurricane could blow through the area, and they would still be sound asleep. Angry, frustrated, and not even wanting to be in the same camping trip as my boyfriend at that time, I decided to take my sleeping bag from the tent, while he didn't even wake up, and go sleep in the truck. My boyfriend then had an old 1991 Ford F-250. There wasn't really much comfortable cab space, but it was better than sleeping in a tent with him. So, I sprawled out as best I could across the front seat, tried to get as comfortable as I could, while trying to fall asleep. If you've ever tried to fall asleep while angry, you'll know it's a pretty hard feat to do. But somehow, somewhere along the way, I managed to doze off, after who knows how many minutes went by of still being angry at him. The doors in the cab were locked, just in case. I always do. The lights were off, and it was pretty dark out, hence it being night, and being in the middle of the woods, up here in northern Michigan. If you're wondering why I wasn't on my phone, well, I have no reception up in the area that we were, and my phone was dead at this point anyway. So all I could do is lie there, close my eyes, and hope the boredom would take me out, which it did eventually. Sometime, I don't know how much time has passed, but I would like to think maybe a couple of hours, because the moon was shifted in its position in the sky at this point, illuminating downwards, kind of like the sun does when it's at noon, directly overhead. Because of this, more of the camp and area was lit up. Even the fire, which when I went to bed, stupid me at the time, left it roaring, and I don't know if I was just so angry that I neglected to put it out, but you should never go to bed with a fire roaring. That was a no. But once I woke up, the fire was just crackling embers, so I knew it had been hours at this point. This is the way everything was when I woke up. But let me get to you the real reason of what woke me up, and the situation at hand that I dealt with. I was asleep when I could hear a sort of heavy, wheezing breathing that did not sound normal. You know how when you're still asleep, and somebody comes in the room, or you hear a noise, and even though you're still kind of half asleep, your brain can process what that noise is, but yet you're not fully awake yet. Well, that's how I was. Me being half awake, or half asleep, whichever way you prefer to see it, just thought it was my boyfriend. But after about 3 or 4 seconds, the breathing and raspy breath was too different than my boyfriend. It sounded nothing like him. I felt the fear start to rise, and that's when my brain took me from halfway asleep to awake in a matter of a second, it felt like. My eyes shot open, and I went to look towards the driver's side window, which, by the way I was sprawled out and laying in the cab, my head was right up against the passenger side door, and my feet were up against the driver's side door. I'm only 5'2", so I slept semi-comfortably in here. Imagine that. When I looked up, all hell broke loose in my mind. Staring at me through the glass was what I can only describe as a real-life looking werewolf, or some sort of freaky, scary wolf-looking face, with the most intense yellow-orange eyes I've ever seen, staring dead into mine, with such an intense look on its face, like it was pissed, and it wanted to hurt me. In fact, the face was so intense and scary, it had an almost human-like emotion to it. It wasn't just an animal staring at me. There was an intelligence to it, a human-like quality, judging from the way the eyes were looking at me, and its expression they seemed to give. The mouth was only open partially, enough that it was breathing out of its mouth. But due to the darkness and the minimal amount of light, even given off by the moon, I couldn't make out any teeth, at least right away. After what felt like 20 seconds, but was probably only 2 seconds, this thing stared at me, and then its eyes drifted slowly down to the door. And to my horror in that moment, my brain put all the pieces I needed to together. This thing had discovered that the way to get to me was through this tiny little piece of metal called a door. And it realized, I think in that moment, judging from the way its eyes were observing the door, that it was staring at the door handle. It stared at that for maybe a second, quickly looked back up at me, and then, not even a half second later, started grabbing the handle and jerking it rapidly and violently. That's when its entire demeanor changed. It went from a fierce, curious look to a violent, rageful, and wrathful creature. After turning Jekyll to Hyde on me, I began screaming at the top of my lungs, not sure what I was to do to keep this monster out of the cab of the truck. Now, it was hissing and growling and making all sorts of horrible noises, along with its terrible breaths, exposing all of its teeth like a frightened animal does. Kind of like if you've ever attacked a possum or got near a possum, how it opens its mouth and shows all of its teeth with its mouth gaping open. That's kind of what it reminded me of. Hence, where I grew up, I've seen enough possums to know that exact look on its face. It was aggressively trying to get into the truck. Part of me was so thankful that I bothered to lock the doors. Had I not, I probably wouldn't even exist anymore. And my mind doesn't even want to know how that thing would have torn me limb from limb, like I know it would have. After maybe trying the door for a little bit longer, it quickly went to the back of the truck, to where I could not see it. That's when I quickly sat up, hid myself in the sleeping bag. Then, it did the exact same thing to the passenger side door, shaking it violently, wiggling the door handle, roaring, growling, and hissing, pressing its face up against the window, drooling and snarling. That went on for probably another 10 seconds. Then, it seemed to disappear. Just when I thought it was done, trying to regain my breath and posture, and trying not to hopefully soil myself, this thing jumps in the bed of the truck and reaches its hand through and shatters the back of the glass. It did this in one solid, fluid motion, shattering the tiny little pane of glass, reaching sporadically for me, and its hand looked like a mix between a raccoon's hand and every sort of werewolf hand you'd ever seen in a movie. But, due to the way it shattered the glass, it really cut itself deep, by a large shard that tore into its hand. As soon as it stuck its arm through the window and tried to grasp for me, it screamed and let out this horrible howl of pain as it got blood all over the seat and ripped part of its arm open. It very quickly retracted its entire arm and hand from the window and cab of the truck. I heard it howling and screaming and making all sorts of noise and commotion. That's when I noticed, too, that the bed of the truck was now lighter It must have left, and now I could hear it barreling through the woods away from me, continuing to howl and scream and make a ton of noise. I took that as an opportunity. I bolted out of the truck, nearly falling on my face because I was still halfway in my sleeping bag. I jumped out, only in a t-shirt and my jeans, and ran towards the tent where my boyfriend was. Luckily, all the commotion was kind of stirring him awake, but I was shaking him frantically, smacking him as hard as I could, begging, screaming for him to wake up, when he asked me what was wrong, and I told him, "There's a monster out there. It broke into your truck and tried to get me." He was still kind of stupefied, in that state of half asleep, half drunk, and trying to process what I was telling him. Fortunately, he had a satellite phone. He was better prepped than I was for camping, and I used that to call 911, telling them. Now, this was important, because had I told them what I saw, they would have thought I was pranking them. So I told them that somebody was out here where we were camping and trying to hurt us with an axe. Yeah, I know lying isn't great, but it was the only way I knew they would ever take us seriously. Well, luckily for us, an officer was very close by, maybe only 10 minutes away from when we called, so he was able to respond and showed up promptly in a matter of time. After we got off the phone, we knew and felt like we would be sitting ducks, sitting in the tent, waiting for this thing to come back and get us, or at least get me, knowing that we're waiting for help to arrive. My boyfriend had a large knife with him, but I doubt that would have done much against whatever it is that I saw. My boyfriend, luckily, not having seen the horrors that I did, or really heard any of the sounds. Yes, he was that passed out drunk, kept trying to reassure me everything was going to be okay, and everything will be fine. During those 10 or 12 minutes that it took for the officer to arrive, that thing that tried to break into the cab of the truck never showed itself again. We didn't hear any more noises after its initial running off. I mean, I would like to think that it got hurt pretty good. I saw how much blood that large shard of glass tore into its arm. That had to have hurt, and with how much it was squealing and screaming and carrying on, that told me that that glass really hurt this thing. Better it than me, I suppose. When the officer showed up there, he could see just how freaked out I was, and asked if everything was okay. Typical officer etiquette. I explained to him what happened, keeping up my false maniac story. When he took a look at the truck himself, looked back at me, and said, "Huh, a maniac, huh? Looks like it was more than that." And the look he gave me, I'll never forget. It's like he knew. He asked to talk to me privately, and so I shrugged my shoulders at my boyfriend, and he pulled me aside and said, "Look, I've been on the job for about 7 years now. I've heard all sorts of stories about things you wouldn't believe. Things that go bump in the night out here in the woods of Michigan, judging by the damage done to the cab and the snot and tracks all around the truck. You're not fooling anybody. I can see that this wasn't done by a person." That's when his demeanor changed to being really nice from serious and stern. He offered my boyfriend and I a ride home. I was very thankful for him taking me seriously, and I finally let my guard down, giving up the fake axe murderer maniac story that I had conceived while calling 911. My boyfriend, on the ride home, coming into full service, placed a call to have the car picked up by a tow truck later on the next day. I know my story isn't much, but I feel like a survivor. I've only ever heard legends of the Michigan Dogman, and I had no clue that I would ever run into one face to face myself one day. If you or anybody you know has an encounter story you would like me to read on this channel, please send it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. The email can be found in the description below. Story 1. Trail of Cadavers. It's true. There's a well-known saying about us park rangers. You get paid in sunrises and sunsets. You don't do this job for the pay. And sometimes, you have to wonder why we work so hard to get these federal jobs. You must know, the people who are naturally inclined to take these kinds of jobs enjoy nature, enjoy complete and utter solitude. It's the most unlikely group of people you'd ever expect to want to work with. And it's probably no secret, you have to give up a lot. It's very difficult for any family or for you to meet somebody. You'll work for years and years until you finally can get a permanent spot, only to realize you're kicked out. But if you're a nature freak like I am, there are so many pros to this position, although just about any job you take has its cons. This one included. I'll let you in on a little story that happened to me a few years back when I was still doing my rounds as a ranger. We had gotten complaints from a campsite at the farther end of the park. I checked this family in myself only a couple days prior. Not the kind that would have a bad attitude. The kind that would be polite and not complain about small, inefficient things. I made my way over there and got a chance to talk to the father. He was complaining that there was this horrendous smell, what he think was possibly a dead deer nearby. He told me he hadn't smelt it the day prior. I went to go check it out myself because when somebody tells you this, you naturally become curious. Now, my first thought was that maybe some coyotes had gone upon a deer, or maybe a doe had just recently died and started rotting and stinking. You never know. So, I go back behind the camp. Everything seems okay. I travel a little further, maybe 30 to 40 yards, and there we go, bingo. In this tiny little crevice in the ground, I found a doe, well, at least part of her. Her spine and innards had been torn out from her stomach and chest. This was a very violent death, something natural predators don't normally seem to do. I've seen the way mountain lion kill, and I've seen the way wolves and coyotes kill. They're all very similar to an extent. They eat the cadaver, they tear things apart, but not like this. This seemed like it was done with human intention or force. This animal also appeared to have broken forelegs, as if something grabbed it, held it down, and tore its body open. It was unusual and very grisly. The other odd piece of it too was that the smell wasn't coming from this doe. In fact, even though this doe had appeared to be dead for a couple days now, was currently bloating, and there were some maggots about, it actually didn't really have much of a smell for whatever reason. And the campers, being about 40 yards away, should not have smelt it at all. Maybe the wind was picking it up. I wasn't sure. It just didn't make much sense to me. So, I disposed of this cadaver or whatever was left. That's when I got a call on my radio, saying that another camper on the other side of the park was also complaining of a very similar situation. An overpowering stench of rotting dead animal, and was convinced there was a bear around. I worked my way all the way to the other end of the park and spoke to this individual, a middle-aged man who was camping by himself, complaining about the same thing as the other family, a horrendous stench of death. Although this time, when I investigated, I went about as far as 100 yards outside of his camp into the forest. I couldn't find a trace of the smell, nor could I find the smell myself, or see any reason why there would be such a smell. I had asked him again, the last time he smelt it, how often had he been smelling it, and he said it would come and go, and only started smelling it in the past day. I did another thorough investigation by myself, but could not find anything. That was the end of that day. About 2 days go by, and I don't hear anything, any more complaints. The park is somewhat busy, which is even more of a surprise that I didn't get any complaints about that particular thing, which I guess is also a good thing. Hopefully, whatever it was had passed, although it's common to find dead animals, sometimes. It wasn't common, the way they were dying, or the way people were describing smelling them, but I guess I didn't think that much of it at the time, considering it was only 2 individuals that made a small complaint. This is where my story ties its ends. I very distinctly remember this day. I can remember it was pouring down rain, or at least throughout the day, we're having bouts of rain. And I got a complaint from an elderly lady and her husband who seemed to be long-term campers. She complained that she had heard some sort of screaming and smelt the awful same stench that had been described to me by previous campers. A scream, I wondered. After inquiring more about it, she described it as maybe a deer or something. Possibly coyotes tearing apart a deer. She wasn't sure. This caused me to investigate further, and maybe I would get to the source of this weird thing going on. But to be able to smell that in the pouring rain and with all the humidity out, which means it had to have been strong. Now, this part of the camp I was at, or part of the park, the brush and forest were much thicker than other areas. Even more of a surprise that she could smell it, which would mean whatever the odor source was had to have been close by. I think I made it maybe 60 or 70 yards in before I finally found the source. After making my way through the brush, I saw what it was that was the source of the smell, and I stopped and had to cover my mouth for fear that I would scream or yell. What I saw in front of me was this large, what I thought was a man, pitch black from head to toe, and built very wide, large shoulders, no neck, and kind of a pointed cone head, barrel-like body, long gorilla-like hair, kind of like orangutan, where it's so long that it kind of hangs off you. Whatever this thing was that I was looking at, I caught it in the act. It had a doe in its hands, and right before my eyes, grabbed its head and twisted its head and neck completely off of its body, as if it was a mere piece of paper. The motion was completely effortless, and the deer, if being close to dead, was now dead, no questions asked. It did it so smoothly and so fluidly, I don't think that deer even had time to even blink. After the head was pulled off, there was of course lots of blood. This thing grabbed the deer by the back of the legs and threw it over its shoulder like a hunter would who had just killed a rabbit, and casually walked off. The smell of death and rotting meat followed with it due to the fear of not being believed, mocked, or potentially losing my job. I never said a word to anybody and kept it to myself. I ended up telling the elderly lady that the situation was taken care of and that it was just a dead deer eaten by coyotes, and we would have it taken care of for her. After that, I never saw anything like that again. So I don't know if this was a Sasquatch or what it was, but maybe it was coming through the area to hunt. That's just a guess. I don't know anything about them, but I guess that would make sense if they're anything like us humans. Thank you for taking the time to listen and read my story. Story 2. Watched from the Trees. I've told a few of my close mates about this same story, and I know they always come to the same conclusion. It was probably some unknown animal. But I've been in the woods a lot, and I'm not exactly sure what unknown animal would mean. But I guess that's really the only way to describe what I heard that day, because I certainly never saw what it was. but it made itself audibly known. This was somewhere between 2007 and 2008. I was working as a forest ranger at the time, doing service work on a closed-down trail, currently for maintenance. This would have been in the spring, and we were busy prepping it to open it back up to the public. There had been a landslide on several parts of the trail due to having such an incredibly wet fall and winter. You can't just allow the public to walk on these, you know. We have to make sure that things are deemed safe. It was roughly 2:30, maybe 3 p.m. in the afternoon. An overcast day. Not cold, but not warm by any means. Roughly around the end of March, and I don't know exactly at what point I picked up on it, but everything around me fell silent. Just the wind. There was an uneasiness about this silence. I know it's entirely possible for the forest to go quiet, but usually there's a reason for it. Sometimes it means there's a large predator in the area. Other times it could just be because animals aren't out. But there was just something about this. Like it wasn't that I just suddenly noticed it. My inner being felt it, if that makes sense to you. And it gave me this incredible uneasiness and made me pick up my pace even faster to get to my destination quicker. I wasn't exactly feeling great about the current circumstances. Although during this, I wasn't thinking anything about monsters in the woods or anything like that. I just did not want to be caught off guard, even if there was a predator, like a mountain lion or something like that. And I'll never forget this part. I got to a curve in the trail when I stopped dead in my tracks. Off to my right, where there's a thicker area of brush and trees, and to my left is a sharp rock wall. I heard a low growling noise. It was a kind of growling, like if you continue to come forward, you're going to get attacked, or eaten, or worse. It made me stop, and I looked around, searching for a source of this noise, but I couldn't see anything. The foliage was just starting to grow back, but still very bare and minimal, considering spring had just barely started, and it wasn't at all like May or June, where everything is full and lush with leaves and brush. The noise was sounding like it was up in the trees, and not at ground level. But I figured that was impossible, because I was looking in the direction that I could have sworn I heard the growling coming from, and there was nothing. But it sounded as if it was coming from an animal merely 20 to 30 feet away from me, right off to my 3 o'clock. There was no way to describe it. And then it got deeper and louder and began to get closer to me, with still nothing to see. This made me incredibly fearful. There was no reason why I should not be able to see whatever it was growling at me. There was nothing terribly obstructing my field of vision or view. There was also really no object or tree that an animal of this capacity that can make this deep of growling could hide behind, at least without getting noticed. No, it was not a bear. There would have been nowhere for a bear to hide and continue to make that noise. Then, I heard a very similar growling noise from off to my left, behind me, to my 7 o'clock, where there was more brush and trees. I quickly turned around, and again, didn't see anything. Now, I had to keep watch of my left and my right, and I felt like I was in a pretty sticky situation. So I quickly put my back against the sharp rock ledge, and slowly walked my way across the path, away from these sounds. This growling noise which continued and continued, but never seemed to move, other than come closer to the spot that I was at on the trail. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe I was going crazy. But the farther I got away from that spot, it seems like the sounds of the forest began to come back. Even though very minimal, there were still sounds present, and now that I was far enough away, I was beginning to hear them again. I ended up talking to my supervisor, and told him that weird stuff is going on the trail, and I would appreciate it if I could walk a different way back and have some help. I should mention this before I forget to, but at that time, my supervisor and the small team of other rangers that I worked with, we all knew that weird stuff went on. None of us were strangers to it, and although we didn't mention anything to the public or to anybody else, we all talked about it, so I felt very comfortable opening up to my supervisor and telling him what had happened. He completely understood. Anyway, I'm sorry if my story isn't all that exciting, but I'm pretty sure it was something other than a wolf or a bear, because neither of those animals make that kind of deep growling. I wish I could tell you what I suspect it was, but I never saw it. Maybe, in some crazy horror science fiction world, it was potentially camouflaged. I don't know. I'll never know. But what I do know is weird stuff like this has gone on in the woods for long, long periods of time, long before I ever became a ranger. If you or someone you know has a story or encounter they would like to share with me and read to my channel, please submit it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. You can find the email in the description below. Story 1. Something from the Swamp. I'm a retired police officer. I have my fair share of insane stories you would probably never believe. Gunfights, finding people overdosed, people cracked out of their minds on drugs, and everything in between. But something I wanted to share with you, since I no longer work in that department, is something that happened to me back around 2001, and, having been in a lot of sticky situations as an officer, doesn't leave a whole lot of room for being scared or frightened. I'm an individual anyway that isn't scared easily, except for maybe when my life is on the line, like I have a drugged maniac coming at me with a knife, or maybe I'm in a gunfight. But other than that, no. But what happened this night is hands down the most frightening experience I would ever have on the job as an officer. I got a call from a lady who was complaining about a lot of noise coming from back behind her house. Where she lived, she was sort of on the outskirts of town. There was swamps behind her house and a large bog. This was also a common place for teenagers to go and drink and cause a lot of noise. There had also been homeless people that have gone back there before, which I also have gotten called into to break up. One time, I found a drunk guy, nearly passed out, nearly drank himself to death, right around the same neighborhood. So, I was already familiar with the territory and the sort of situation that I was most likely getting myself into. I politely answered the door and talked to the lady in question. She told me what I had already assumed. Lots of loud banging and noise coming back behind the swamp and bog area, just beyond her backyard. I politely told her I would go investigate, let her know if I found anything worthwhile. She gave me full permission to go through the gate on her backyard, to go off into the little bog of swampland. I did just that. Shining my flashlight around, I didn't see much signs of anything. But then, things began to take a turn really quickly. I heard something, what I thought originally was a large animal, coming towards my direction from directly ahead of me. It was foggy, so I couldn't see clearly until I shined my light, and coming at me at a fast pace was something I'd never seen before. This isn't Hollywood. What I saw approaching me, coming toward me, simply shouldn't exist, and I have no explanation for why it was there. And I can certainly tell you, as an officer, this was no person in a costume. This was a living, breathing animal or being. What my eyes witnessed almost defies reality in a way. This thing looked like a prehistoric creature, like half man, half dinosaur. A long protruding face with a mouth full of dagger-like teeth. Hundreds of small sharp needle prick teeth, and eyes that were very predatory, very reptilian. It kind of reminded me of an alligator almost, except much uglier. This thing was also much taller than I, walked on 2 legs, and was built like somebody who goes to the gym 5 days a week. It approached me slowly enough that I had time to pull up my Glock and fire 3 shots directly into this thing's chest. Not exactly sure what this animal or thing was capable of. I wasn't going to be taking any chances. It stopped, looked down at his chest, where there was apparently no blood. I didn't even see any bullet holes. Then, it looked back up at me and gave me this smirk of an expression. That's when I turned around, fled back up the small hill, through the ladies' gate, and immediately radioed dispatch, telling them, "We have a serious situation. I'm going to need backup." While waiting, I knocked on the lady's door. She answered. I told her to stay inside and that it is currently not safe to be walking around outside at night, even if it's just taking out your trash. She understood and can sense the worry in my voice and my demeanor. She had heard the gunshots being fired and began to grow very concerned, asking me questions. What's going on? What happened? And I had to politely decline her of answering those and wait for my partner to arrive. Fortunately, I had one of my partners arrive within 4 minutes of dispatch time. We both ended up going back down there and investigating further. We didn't end up seeing that same animal or thing that I saw come towards me, potentially hostile. I explained to them what I saw, and even though they were a little hesitant, because I feel like this partner, whom I won't mention, who still serves currently, didn't quite believe me at first, but I think the more he saw, and the more he heard me tell, I think he believed me. When we got down there, though, we saw nothing. Whatever it was must have left, and the lady never called back, complaining about noises. Although, for future reference, we still did have complaints around that general area, but afterwards, I guess it was just homeless people, drunks, and things like that. Whatever that creature was straight out of the X-Files. I'll never forget it. Story 2. Small Town Terror. Back in the late 80s, I used to serve as an officer for my small rural town. There wasn't much of a town there. It had all your usual: an auto body shop, a grocery store, a bank, a realtor, a community center, all the workings of a small town, and then some, followed by roads and roads of small neighborhoods where everything was intertwined and interconnected. Everybody pretty much knew everybody. Anytime you would go to the post office, you were sure to bump into somebody that knew you, or you knew them, playing the catch-up conversation while you waited to get your mail. Because of this, most of my time was usually spent on the highway near town, catching and giving traffic violations. But on one October evening, back in the fall of 1988, I got a phone call from the manager at a grocery store in town. He told me there's been some disturbances behind the store, and thinks either somebody is casing it or potentially a drug deal. He wasn't exactly sure. He begged me to come and investigate. So I did. I stopped by the store, had a polite but short conversation with him, and went to go investigate. While arriving at the very back of the store where the dumpster was, everything appeared normal, and after shining my light, I didn't see anything out of place until I saw movement. Out from behind a little alcove in the back, right where the dumpster is, right before I had checked it, walked this thing that I've never seen before, except it was on all fours, crawling around like an animal. I thought, what is that thing? As I assumed it was a person, naked, but it was pale and didn't really have much of a face. It was very awkwardly walking on all fours, as if its legs and arms were broken. It took one look at me and scurried off quickly, back behind the parking lot, where the woods are. I've never seen any such thing in my life. I didn't believe in aliens, but that right there made me a believer. Story 3. Werewolves are real. This is a story I don't share often, but I feel enough time has passed that I feel it appropriate to at least tell you, of anybody, as long as my identity and credentials are kept secret. I have given them to you just for verification. I didn't believe in the existence of monsters, or as you call them, cryptids. And while discussing with you, you seem to have told me that werewolves aren't exactly real, but that they are called dogmen, creatures that don't transform over a full moon, like pop culture portrays, but merely these are just canine-like creatures that walk bipedally. This is what I saw this night. Back in 2015, when I was still just a deputy, I was doing my nightly patrol, and I think it was just a little after midnight, when out in front of my car runs this creature on two legs. At first, I thought it was a man in a costume and was about ready to do some severe questioning, but it ran so incredibly fast that I knew it could not have been anywhere close to human, and the very small glimpse I caught of it was more than enough to see that there's no way this could have been a person. If this was somebody in a costume, and they would have had to spend thousands of dollars perfecting a costume that looked so realistic. But then there's the physics aspect. How would they move around so fast in it? Plus, I saw rippling muscles underneath the flesh. I saw matted fur, and it had a very wild look to it. Like you could tell, this thing had been living out in the wild. It darted so fast across the road. It basically blew my mind. This thing was also taller than a man, easily 8 to 9 feet, towering over the top of my cruiser. I nearly hit it had I not been paying attention, but it darted so fast into the other trees across the road, I never saw it after that. I tried stopping and shining light in that direction, but I never saw any signs of it afterwards. I never told anybody in my department about it. It's something that I've kept to myself. Until now. I hope you enjoy it. Growing up, I'd always heard stories from friends and family who were a part of the Navajo reservation. Don't let your cigarette shine in the darkness. Be careful what you say. Be careful what you do. You just might attract a skinwalker. I never gave much attention or importance to those very crucial details, and I wouldn't until that very night, on June 15th, 2009, where my life changed forever. During this time of my life, I was 19 years old, fresh out of high school, having started school a year later than my fellow peers, which put me a year higher than everybody else in my grade. I was driving to Southern California, up from the very tip of Arizona. I was in the process of moving down to San Diego, tired of the life that I was living down in Arizona where I was at, tired of the same old friends and family. It was becoming too toxic for me, even though the things they warned me about of the culture were very, very true, that I refused to believe in at the time. Growing up, I always just assumed they were folklore, tales to scare kids with to make sure they don't stay after dark, or made up stories by native drunks. Little did I know, shamans, people who realistically practice magic, the dark kind, and people who had the ability to shapeshift into whatever animal skin they wore, were all very, very real. So, on that day, June 15th, 2009, I was making one of several trips down to my new apartment just outside of San Diego. Because of my tiny 1991 Honda Accord, I couldn't fit that many things, and due to my family being poor, I didn't really have the means of help, which means I had to make several trips back and forth, loading a few boxes at a time. This was probably either the second or third trip down there. I was exhausted, sleep deprived, tired of driving hour after hour on the road. Sure, I loaded up on coffee, Monster energy drinks, whatever I can find to keep myself wired, so I can make these horrendous trips as fast and efficiently as I possibly could, without totally killing myself, by giving myself a sleep-induced heart attack, or should I say, lack of sleep. I would frequently pull over and try and take short 3 to 4 hour interval sleeps, just to allow my body some rest. It was pretty rough, I'm not gonna lie. And on that day, June 15th, 2009, it was later on at night, probably closer to midnight. I don't exactly remember the time. I was just leaving Mexican Water. I had just stopped and got gas and refueled. Mexican Water is at the very topmost border of Arizona, still very much in the Navajo area. I was heading southwest, down on the 160. I don't even recall being out of town for more than 10 minutes. There's no way it could have been longer than that. I had just stopped and refueled, smoked a cigarette, and no, I was not being conscientious or aware of keeping my cigarette cherry covered like I should have. Out in the darkness next to my car, not really caring or even thinking. But I had done this time and time again, never had an issue, so I'm not sure why this specific time was any special. Maybe it wasn't, but part of me wants to try and put 2 and 2 together, because maybe they were related. So, I'm about 10 minutes or so down the road, and I'm getting very tired. I've already had 2 monsters, and my body can only sustain so much. So I turn on the radio, try and find some good music to try and keep myself awake. I tried blaring it. It helped a little bit, but not the best. And to answer your question, if my lack of sleep caused me to hallucinate any of this, well, no. I wasn't that tired, just more worn out from the constant driving. I just got done tinkering with the radio when I look up just in time to see this large shape, what looked to be coming towards my vehicle. No, running towards my vehicle, on 4 legs, very fast. As it got closer, my headlights lit this thing up. That's when I can make out in a split second. This was an enormous, large black wolf with piercing red eyes, coming right head first towards my vehicle. I yelled, went to slam on my brakes, but just as I did that, it came in contact with my vehicle and leapt over the front, over my hood, and behind. I nearly swerved off the road, screaming. Had I swerved just a little harder, I would have flipped my vehicle. I was sitting there on 160, facing perpendicular to the highway. My vehicle fully stopped. I'm breathing heavily, looking around me, trying not to have a panic attack, thinking to myself, what was that I just saw? But I quickly regained any sort of control that I had lost in that moment, turning my vehicle back around and going the way I was supposed to originally go, shaking it off. But now, this lingering feeling crept over me. This paranoia that I can't describe. Now, I found myself, about every 5 or 10 seconds, looking over my shoulder into the rearview mirror, or my side mirrors, as if I was expecting something to be there. Wouldn't you know it, Not even a couple of minutes later, the radio now turned off because I felt like I couldn't concentrate. This shape, this same black wolf, was now running behind my car. Its eyes gave it away, and I could see it in my rearview mirror, getting closer and closer, even though now I'm pushing 65, 70, 75. It appeared to have no problems at all keeping up, like it was toying with me. And then it disappeared again, and reappeared on the driver's side of my vehicle, keeping right up with me, and actually going faster by getting right up to my driver's side door, looking over at me, and giving me this terrifying grin, as if kind of a gotcha expression. I swear I saw it smirk at me. Not a happy smirk, like a devious, sinister smirk, like just wait till I get my hands on you, till I could show you what evils I can really do. That was the feeling it gave me. But I had to keep my eyes on the road, going nearly 80 miles an hour, or else I would have probably crashed and killed myself. Between my eyes darting onto the road and back at this thing, it disappeared again. Now I was even more freaked out. Not sure what I was doing, not sure what was following me, or what was my now plan of action. I was driving a dinky little 1991 Honda Accord. It's not like I had a Ferrari and could outpace this thing. My car was a hunk of junk, purchased from my older uncle, who had put that thing through lots of wear and tear. If it came down to my life needing saved, well, I didn't trust this thing. It was a cheap hunk of metal. That's about all it was good for, is getting me from point A to point B. And now, I was having to rely on this thing to keep me safe from whatever that thing is. In that moment of time, well, during the course of this entire event, the thought of this being a skinwalker or a shapeshifter never occurred in my mind. In fact, I didn't know what it was. I figured it was supernatural, some sort of evil, but I never thought of it being somebody who shapeshifted, or somebody brought on by evil towards me. Another minute or so went by, when all around me, I couldn't see it. Behind me, to the sides of me, or in front of me. Then it appeared again, in front of me, on the side of the highway, on my passenger side. This time, standing up on two legs, in a position just like a sprinter would, looking ready to pounce on my vehicle the second it drove by. Its eyes and face were directly looking right at me, as if waiting for the right moment. And in my horror, my jaw was dropping as I looked at this thing driving by. It leapt, just as my worst nightmare would have expected. It leapt directly onto my vehicle, and the sheer weight of this thing nearly knocked my vehicle over. It was quite an impact, and caused me to almost swerve off the road again. But I regained control, and in that time, this thing had climbed up onto my roof and was trying to break my windows by smacking them. Now, I was in a full-blown panic, trying to swerve to throw this thing off my car. That's when the entire car began filling with two things. The smell of putrid death, like I had never smelt in my life. Imagine finding a dead deer on the side of the road, throwing it in the cab of your car, and letting it sit there on a hot summer day. Now, I want you to take that even further. Go and sit in the cab with this dead, rotting deer. Can you imagine the utter putrid smell of being trapped and enclosed in a very small area with a dead carcass? The smell would be intoxicatingly powerful, making you vomit. That's how this was, as if my face was being shoved in the smell of rot. That putrid smell, along with the most demonic native chanting I'd ever heard, complete with drums banging, as if I was being surrounded by some sort of demonic native ceremony, filling my car. And that's when I felt my body begin to change, like I was in a trance, or being possessed, or something. It almost felt like the lifeblood of me being drained out, like this thing was sucking my soul from atop the roof of my car, holding on, still maintaining a quick speed. My entire body was turning numb, and I felt like I was losing consciousness, all while trying to maintain composure enough to drive my vehicle. And just then, as I was losing consciousness more and more, feeling like I was falling into a deep sleep, as if I was being frozen to death, my entire body temperature was dropping. I could feel it. It was one of the worst things I'd ever felt. I just knew, in my subconscious, in my inner being, I was dying. Then, just like a Hollywood movie, in the nick of time, a semi-truck was coming my direction, on the opposite lane. Just as soon as those headlights shone from that truck, everything stopped. The smell, the chanting, the drumming, and I felt whatever that thing was leaping off the roof of my car. I don't know where it leapt off to, but it jumped off somewhere. I drove faster than I ever could, while regaining my body temperature, regaining my feeling from being numb, regaining my consciousness. I was very fortunate that I was only about 2 or 3 minutes outside Dinahatso, which is roughly around 20 minutes from where I last filled up. There isn't much civilization there either, as really that's kind of how all of Arizona is. But I pulled in to the market, and I slept there in the parking lot while I cried and cried, shaking in fear, not sure what to do. For some stupid reason, I should have had a cell phone, but I didn't, prioritizing other stupid things in my life, other than having a means of communication. The next morning, I asked a stranger if I could borrow their phone, called my grandfather, and told him exactly what had happened. And actually, I didn't just speak to my grandfather, but also my father, and they both told me I had attracted a skinwalker. They called it the native word, which I won't repeat, just in case I'm going to somehow attract it again, and I don't want that. I figured the word skinwalker is a little more safer. They told me that I have to go see a medicine man and get clean before I could resume my trip. So, I drove my sweet butt all the way back in the opposite direction, seeking the medicine man that our family sees, getting blessed, and hoping that I was okay. After that, I never made any more trips after dark. If it was going to get dark and I wouldn't make it to my destination, I slept in any parking lot I could find, and would only drive from now on during the daylight. This experience has molded me, shaped me, changed me from my inner being outward. I'll never be the same. If you or somebody you know has a terrifying experience you would like to share with me or for me to read to my viewers, please send it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. You can find the email in the description below.